So for the benefit of everyone, what we were intending to do today, and we're going to do part of that obviously, because we're going to look at the theoretical framework and how that divides between clinical and personal development. Part of that was to help John understand himself as an extended field. And I know he already knows that. And we can know things at a cognitive level because it makes sense in an abstract way. But when we know it because we access the feeling that confirms it or the intuition that confirms it, that's very different. Now, if you guys have got any experience in helping people to stop smoking, the normal ways of doing this using psychological methods based on, say, CBT, perhaps even heard of hypnosis, don't have a particularly high success rate. They have some success. Hypnosis on its own without CBT is effective. But once you introduce something which is abstract and takes a person away from their extended field, and I'm emphasizing that, then the abstraction becomes the reference point. I'm going to talk about this, Paulie and I, later in more depth because this is so important. The level of abstraction, the separation between the framework that we use with something like this, or indeed pretty much anything, is decisive because it can slow us right up. And what can happen then is that the therapy goes towards the idea and not the actual thing in itself. So the representation, the idea of hypnosis is addressed by a rational cognitive approach, but the actual process of smoking, what it means to the person, and specifically by extended field, what I mean is that, and you will know this, you guys, there is a psychological level of psychology, but there is a biological consciousness as well, which although it is connected and is superpositioned, nevertheless can function in a dissociated way. So we can have something like smoking, which runs autonomously to some extent from the rest of the personality. So the person may, yeah, I don't actually need this, and I feel much better in so many other ways in my life, but there's the connection to, say, nicotine. The nicotine patch is interesting because very often with people who smoke, I'll just hold this biscuit up as a cigarette. The identification with this, say, if this were a cigarette, as being something which I utilize to identify with is something that's quite easy or easy to deal. Yeah, it is easy to deal with because it's a thing that you can let go of, that you can physically drop. The same with, say, a cigarette lighter, that can drop as well. And my general approach, once we've built rapport up, is to have a person hold a cigarette lighter and hold a cigarette. And then we utilize a letting go. So the unconscious mind decides when and if it wants to let go of the cigarette and the lighter, because it's reached a stage of inner peace and integration that is separate from the state that it needs to smoke within. So in other words, the self-concept can separate itself from the act of smoking, that the behavior, the pattern of smoking. So that's one element, which when you've got something like that, rather than say a patch, is more obvious. The other important thing, and you may have heard me say this before, to do with smoking, is that most people remember a time psychologically before they smoked. It wasn't part of them. It wasn't part of their self-concept. And of course, there are some cases where, say, a mother was a heavy smoker, and then there's a kind of habituation in the womb to the presence of the chemicals within a cigarette, and then the child is almost born with a craving that can't be satisfied because it's not smoking directly. But the memory of that will be retained at a biological level and then accessed later in life, and the child finds themselves wanting to smoke. And then there's a continuity between that physiological state that's way, way back and a present physiological state that joins it up, and it gives the impression of being a continuity of the self-concept and of the self-image. Now that can be dealt with as well. in a similar way, but you have to add another kind of tuning to it. Well, when it comes to someone who started to smoke at a particular time in their life, and there was literally a day before that they didn't do that, but they did start, then there is a line across the timeline. That's the time. There is a definite line. After this line, the person was a smoker. Before that, they were not. And their physiology can hold, and does hold, a representation of not being a smoker. In such cases, that's where you go. You go to that. And I say it's more obvious where there is a cigarette and there's a cigarette lighter, and they can let go and they can integrate that into their self-concept and self-image. And the physiology then is encouraged to adopt the state before it was altered by smoke or nicotine or wherever the chemicals might be. That works very well because there's a biological level of consciousness that's ignored if we use, say, a CBT model, and it's top down. And we're trying to say, I don't need this. You know? Well, the ego might not need it, but the body thinks it's normal. And you're not talking to your body. You're not talking to your timeline. But when you do, and then that part of the self-concept is updated because it experiences another kind of physiology which remembers what it's like to not smoke. That's the ideal state that you bring somebody into. And John is describing that, you know, that he knows that he can be happy without it, but there is something lingering, which at the moment for him, just for the moment, seems to suggest to him that he could do with the nicotine to calm him down or put his system, his whole field into a particular state. So where something like that happens, then we can see that it's a field phenomenon that has different aspects to it that are simultaneously present, and each element is dissociated within the wider field into component parts, each of which is perhaps not communicating, not updating. So we can say there's a perseveration, that is a repeating of the past state, which is still operating within the wider field. So homeostasis being about self-regulation, and we always go to homeostasis, will, as you guys all know, put up with suboptimal adaptation if there is some residual benefit to maintaining a part of the past state. So in John's case then, if he were to do self-hypnosis on this, and I'm sure he will, and Paul and I will help, of course, in this, then he'd need to be able to isolate gently and then access that part of his wider field that represents the apparent advantage of utilizing a nicotine patch at this point in his trajectory of lifespan development. And if we're gentle about this, then we don't meet resistance. That's really important. Just as with someone who is still using cigarettes and a lighter, and they have a superpositioned habituation to doing that, if we push too hard, then the wider field will find elements that will resist that because they're giving something up with giving up the cigarettes. So to utilize then the example of someone who may have started to smoke age 13, we'll say, as an example. Very often this is typical with people who then become heavy smokers and find it very difficult to let go of that habit. But something would have happened adaptively at the age of 13 that meant that it was utilized, became identified with, part of the self-concept psychologically, but then also that part of the self-concept that includes the biology, the physiological state as paired with psychology, formed a field, in other words, a complex that associated itself, but had sufficient strength to maintain itself. How does that happen? Well, there's usually some kind of gain involved, some kind of advantage. And typically with smoking at that age, it can be any of the following, or all of them to different degrees. There'll be peer group recognition. if there are people around the person at the time who smoked and encouraged it. So you smoke like us, you're part of the group, your status increases, you hold rank within the peer group. The second one can be that it might be the rejection of parental or other authority who would disapprove of smoking. So the normal adolescent urge to break away from the parents might mean that smoking becomes symbolic of independence. So already we have two elements: independence, status, and peer group recognition. All of those things can be very important. So moving forward then, if such a person says, I want to stop smoking, and they go into a stop smoking clinic within healthcare provision, which is CBT orientated, they're very unlikely to be able to do anything other than describe in a rational way, superficial rational way, why the person smoked and why they should give it up. They might give them all sorts of health reasons, talk about positive thinking over negative automatic thoughts, that kind of thing. They may even suggest that when you take or have a cigarette, then you're going to suppress anxiety. But they don't know or understand what anxiety is. They don't understand its drive pressure or something else. So homeostasis will then say, if you take my cigarettes off me, I am going to lose status and I am going to be influenced by authority figures like you, therapist, and suddenly the therapist gets the transference, the parental transference, the parents who didn't want them to smoke. And you can see then how it gets far more complicated than it needs to be. And that results in a high failure rate for that kind of intervention. But there's another thing about utilization of tobacco, like other forms of substance, is that it alters consciousness. It generates a state which then reinforces itself. Most people describe that as a calming effect. And it is an anxiolytic. It does reduce anxiety. But anxiety is a drive state. So that means that other things are being replaced by the cigarette or the nicotine use. Now, the person might then think or feel, all I'm aware of is the drive state, and if I have a cigarette, I feel better. So there's a superficial behavioral modification and conditioning that comes from that. But suppose that the drive pressure they're feeling is to solve other problems that they are pushing away. Then literally the smoking is a smoke screen that conceals from the ego the reason why it feels anxious anyway. And that might be another adaptive challenge in their life. So it becomes difficult to let go of that. Now, I'm not making a direct suggestion at all, or even an indirect one with respect to John, but an adaptive challenge can be changing a relationship, because relationships are more than what they appear to be, and we're going to discuss that shortly, aren't we? Yeah, the field nature of
Yes,
that.
yes.
And, yeah, changing a relationship is a highly stressful thing to do. When we do that and we achieve it, there's a lot of benefit from that. That means that we can reduce a lot of the displacements in our life. But there might be a residual reserved element in the background, which homeostasis will justify to itself as saying, if I should need this, I've got access to it. But it's reduced. It's not the same as it was before. Now, with people who smoke, say we get someone who is a heavy smoker, might smoke 3 packets of 20 a day or something like that, and then they go through a process to stop smoking, and they reduce it by 2/3. So they've dropped 40 cigarettes a day and only having 20. Well, that shows some drive pressure is gone, but there's a reserve, an attachment to the reserve as a contingency to meet transitional adaptive challenges. So that can sit there as a reserve, and some people are comfortable with that because they've reduced it, but other people want it to go completely. So what we have to do then is address the homeostatic regulatory field through dissociation. Remember, cigarettes cause dissociation, a kind of their own, through dissociation, but a healthy one, which means that we can then persuade homeostasis that the use of the substance is no longer needed, because already I have made great gains and they can be consolidated. And I have the ego strength that can allow me to move through this transitional phase into a new life of adaptation. Now, this should be presented internally through self-hypnosis in a very gentle way. If you think of homeostasis as being conscious up to a point, not the same as ego conscious, but it understands itself, it understands its task. And even in a mechanistic way, it will check an algorithm, if you like, and say, can I allow the ego to stop smoking or stop using nicotine? Can I do that? Or do I need this functional reserve? Now, if the ego is anxious when it approaches homeostasis, then homeostasis will run the algorithm and the conclusion will be not yet. Because there's still drive pressure there. The adaptation has not been made. Ego strength isn't complete enough. So we will allow the reduced use of either cigarettes or a nicotine patch for now, until we understand that the ego isn't in the drive state that needs to be balanced in another way, such as using nicotine patches or smoking. So we can conceive of this always as being a homeostatic or regulatory issue, whereby homeostasis will constrict the ego's adaptability. It will narrow that if the ego is not signaling in the right way to homeostasis. How do we signal in the right way? We have to approach it in a calm way. We have to demonstrate that the ego itself is strong enough, not in a hard way, not rigid strength, because that's anxiety. You know, rigidity in the body is anxiety. We have to be relaxed in body, relaxed in mind, slow in the way that we articulate our approach to the homeostasis. So homeostasis will read the algorithm, the ego's in a better state. Now we can let go of that functional reserve. It's no longer needed. So that's the way to do it. And that actually works too with smoking itself. It's just more obvious with a cigarette and with a cigarette lighter, for example, that you can really get in there very, very quickly and make the dissociation and the separation from identity of that. Because when you put someone who's a smoker into a state where they're holding a cigarette and they are holding a cigarette lighter, but it's not been lit up. The mechanical action of lighting is not paired to lighting the cigarette and then taking an inhalation. None of that's happened, but I feel better now than when I do when I smoke. This is a better state to be in. That signals homeostasis. Well, we don't need this. We don't need it at all. And then what you do, to go back to what I was saying earlier about the example of a 13-year-old who is a smoker or was a smoker, you detach the identification with whatever element was supportive for smoking in the first place, the non-attachment, the non-identification, through the methods that we've discussed recently, where the ego separates itself into its qualia. It no longer thinks that way. It no longer feels those feelings. It no longer has an internal model which it identifies with, and it no longer needs an external action and behavior that brings about the confirmation of that external state on the inside to support the self-concept in its retrogressive identification. Now, in simple terms, I've just described 4 out of the 5 metaqualia of consciousness. I haven't touched intuition yet, but I've done the others: the cognition, the affect, the interoception or introverted sensing, exteroception, relating in real time externally. If all of that can configure without the need for the substance, then the person is adapted. And as we progressively do that, homeostasis moves towards the ego to receive its new configuration. That also makes it a relaxed approach. It's tentative because homeostasis will want to test and say, are you really in this state? Oh, you are. Okay, right, now we can reconfigure in a different way. And what that will do is release potential that's been hiding behind the smoke screen. In the case of a smoker, who's been smoking, say, from the age of 13. But you have to help that person disidentify. So you can say that, you will gain, not lose, you will gain autonomy. You will gain respect. You will gain autonomy as freedom of action by not smoking, because you will not have your behavior controlled by that anymore. There are no parents to resist now. You've moved beyond the need to do that. You can gain friends and have status without the need for the cigarettes, without the need for the nicotine. So it's a process of gently removing attachment to the behavior, but also the substance, because the behavior and the substance form the field of the complex which is associated with smoking or the use of nicotine. So that would be an overview of how you approach. But the most important thing in self-hypnosis, where there's no third party guiding you through that, is that you have to make the approach to homeostasis and use language patterning and pacing, very, very gentle. Everything that you show must suggest that you are ready to be capable of receiving what you need to move on. I'm going to give an example from Cesar Millan again, the dog whisperer. Yeah. If you haven't watched him, we saw him with two very aggressive German shepherds that were biting everybody, including the owner. He calmed that dog down very, very quickly, non-aggressively, by, in his own words, emitting calmness and an understanding of instinct and a shared goal towards having a better adaptation. The dog read the field of Cesar Millan and calmed right down. It's the same with drive pressure. When the drive pressure, which is coming out of the genome, it's gene expression, it's also part of homeostasis still. Homeostasis actually makes us smoke because of past experiences. When the algorithm is run and the decision is made, the ego's fine, then everything calms down and we can move away. So I've said a lot there. Would you?
I would just, well, just the example you've given of Cesar Millan, he, particularly when he's working with the aggressive dogs, he monitors homeostasis in real time. So he will keep checking his own internal state with respect to the dog. And I guess we need to do that a little bit ourselves, don't we? If we don't check in on our inner state on a relatively regular basis, this is how we miss things, really. This is how we push ourselves or extend ourselves beyond what is homeostatically viable for us. So I think just getting used to doing that without being obsessive about it, of course. I mean, he does it very acutely when he's in a very specific situation. So, he will visibly, sigh to let the stress move away from him, and he will do that repeatedly if he needs to, and then he will check the dog's response to his internal state, and it's something that he encourages other people to do as well, and then adds that to being the calmness that they then have as a result of that, to feeling confident as well, which is important too. So it's what, in that context, it means being very aware of what we signal, doesn't it? We're to our extended field of relationship, whether it's a dog or a human being. And interestingly, that episode we watched last night, he was busy doing all of that. He got the dog to respond, and on the strength of that, he brought his film crew in behind him.
There were six then.
There were six at that point, including a woman she had a tennis racket like he did, just in case she had to
not to hit the dog,
to block the dog, just in case she had to step in and give him some additional support. But at the point at which he got the dog to respond to him and his energy, the dog actually ran past him and went for her. Presumably because she was in a different state. So it shows it works. It does, and it shows that if you're not in the right state, then you, in a situation like that, you can provoke aggression. So it's well worth knowing about these things.
So there's an analogue there about the resistances on the inside that want to resist change because of the habit strength of whatever it is that we're doing. The habit strength of a complex, which is set up to deal with something. So if you approach in a completely different way, it reverses the polarity on the complex. And it starts to dysfunction with respect to attacking the ego or directing it. It calms down and maybe even dissolves and dissipates. And the way he does the exaggerated breathing, we would probably not do. In fact, I know I wouldn't with a human being. But dogs do that. If you own a dog and you see when a dog lets go, it's visible, and he does that, and he communicates in the way that the dog does. He makes eye contact in the way that a dog will. He arranges his posture in the way that a dog will. So there's rapport, and we need to have rapport with homeostasis. The first step is to say, what does it want from us? It wants us to be calm, and relaxed, and paced. Then it will respond in the right way. But if we're anxious, then it says, no, you can't come in, we can't change. You need the drug or whatever it might be as an anxiolytic, you need that. And therefore the dependency will be maintained in your interests from homeostasis, because that's what it's receiving. So we need to send off the signal that we are open and we are ego strength, ego strong in a relaxed way.
Well, in this situation, he knew the dog had relaxed because its mouth relaxed, and its tongue was hanging out. And so obviously there are different cues for dogs to humans, but he's very sensitive to that. He's working in the dog's interest, isn't he? He's working for the dog, so he has to understand the dog's instincts specifically and the way that they're configured. So if we know, in an equivalent way what human beings are likely to do, when we need to look out for those cues when we're working with people. So and sometimes people will just will sigh.
They will, and we can know about that, but we don't need to sigh with them.
No, we do not.
So it's different interpersonally, because we should use our energy to calm them down and not simply mirror it.
That's true. And obviously it's done for the purposes of a television program as well, isn't it? There's all of that, but not in the clinical context.
But the idea is working with a field of information where within that field there are different elements. So whether that's a dog and a camera crew of 6, but a highly red zone 10 level dog that will attack and bit its own owners. So it's all about that, and that's what I've been saying up to this point, which is how do we relate? How do we relate to the non-ego, which is regulating everything? Homeostasis is the focus of that. We have to show that we are calm and that we can do without that problem. So I think it'd be useful to stop here and ask for any questions, so I can go back and draw out any element anyone needs to know or understand about this process, because it's essentially the same with any complex. When you gain the trust, then they do trust. It's a very, very, very clear state. I'll come on with you to the situation level reference of a field, because I think that is important shortly. Thank you, Marcelo. Would anybody like to raise or question anything to do with what we've said about how the personality acquires along its timeline a self-reference, for example, that might be that I am now a smoker, and then later, if I give up smoking, I'm giving up what I gained at the age of 13. Like, for example, resist my parents, get confirmation from the peer group. Anything like that, a possible or potential configuration. If you can find out what that is, then you can work with that to remove it. If we ignore it, we come up against resistance. And as we've been saying recently, classical psychodynamics, Freud principally, blamed the ego for that. They always blame the ego. They say, this is the ego. It's being recalcitrant, it won't change, it's resisting. But when you realize that these patterns of interpretation and response that settle in are outside of the ego and control the ego, basically, at least in a certain bandwidth, then that's what we need to look at. We need to look at that bit which is partitioned off and is functioning autonomously outside of the conscious mind's awareness of itself, but inside at the same time consciousness's awareness of itself. So when it looks inside the mirror, I'm a smoker. No, smoking is something. It's a something which you've acquired and identify with along your timeline, and perhaps you'd forgotten when that was, but there was a time when it was not a part of you, but apart from you, a before time. And now it's about time to change. That kind of thing. So I'm using language patterning. Wherever your native language is, you can arrange that accordingly. But the language that you're using to yourself is important, because a metaphor is a natural, for example, a very natural way of using language to get beyond language, because the metaphor carries a very high bandwidth of information, which, as I say, is beyond what it appears to be. That's why it unpacks. But if we have a logical, rational, dialectical, in that ordinary sense, debate, everything collapses into that kind of dialectical process. And then you get philosophy. And of course, they can talk forever without a proper conclusion to anything. But when we use language patterning to get beyond language itself, then the symbols, the representational symbols of the fields that they truly represent, interact. And that's where I want to get to with Paul. And I want to get to the idea of how a scenario has its own consciousness. It's really important, isn't it?
It is. Could I just make a very
yes, please,
very quick point, just based on what you've said. Obviously, you weren't using language patterning as such earlier. When you were giving your overview with respect to stopping smoking, you used the word linger, for example. Which is useful, and this is how you can start to, I think, acquire a vocabulary yourself for dealing with problems like this, because the idea of saying lingering, smoke lingers.
It does.
We all know that.
I said smoke screen.
And you use smoke
as
screen as well.
Yeah.
So yes.
Which is a metaphor.
It is.
Forgive me, I'll just
no,
complete
it's
this.
fine. Yes, of course.
It's a metaphor for concealment. Or for an unwillingness to look in the right place.
Yeah.
I'd like to continue with the nuances of that in a moment.
Yes, sure.
And I've also got to get to Mladen as well.
Right. One very quick point. You said about going back to a time before.
Yeah.
It may also paradoxically be a time after, because if for that person they first experienced, say, nicotine in the womb, then there will be a time after rather than before that may be a kind of an interval, if you like, between having been exposed to nicotine literally at the beginning of their timeline, and then a point in their life, because they've already maybe been predisposed in that way to it biologically, to then picking it up, say, when you're starting to smoke when they come into their teenage years. So just something to bear in mind.
Yeah, well, that's certainly one view, and I accept it. The other view is Platonic, of course, which is there is an anticipation within the genome that you won't ever be a smoker.
Yeah.
And that's one of the ways that we access the transpersonal with any other kind of complex, including post-traumatic stress disorders, which can arrest a person's memory at the point of the trauma. Very often they don't remember anything before it, because the amplitude of the impact of a trauma to, say, a child is such that there is no memory before it. But there is. The memory, though, has been shifted away from immediate focus. But there's an ancestral memory too, which says the option not to be a smoker has existed way back along your timeline, your evolutionary timeline.
Yeah.
More of your ancestors have never smoked than those who have. Now that can help a person skip right back into their potential to never have taken up smoking, even if they've been exposed to it in the womb. So they're complementary, aren't they?
Yes. Yes. I'm just raising it in case that appears to contradict some of what's been said. But as you rightly say, it just depends on your starting point, doesn't it?
It does.
If your starting point is the ancestral psyche, then we don't see that as being problematic.
Not at all.
We move beyond it.
Yeah.
So just really raising it for those reasons, to make sure we get a bigger picture of what might be going on, because you don't know who's going to walk in.
No,
clinically,
you don't.
And present.
Yeah, everything is interactive, isn't it?
Yes.
And it's very important you access the field. And we've spoken in the background, before, that we have the figure and we have the ground, and the figure is the immediate presentation of a person, but they bring their background with them.
Yeah.
And that's part of the nuance that we wanted
that we
wanted to get to today.
Yeah.
Because it's a general principle. And I had a conversation, I'm sure Bob won't mind me mentioning this, because we were talking in another context about police work, to do with what happens in an emergency scenario when a police officer shoots somebody. Because apparently a decision was taken to use a weapon. And Bob's very interested in this because he trains police officers. Part of the conversation went to something which is unusual. And I was talking with Bob and a colleague of his who's a trainer, great guy, a serving sergeant in the US police, who deals again with this kind of trauma all the time. And it's simply this, and it is simple, but we have to work back from it. Let's start with the figure ground again. When somebody comes in, the ground is present because it's superpositioned with the person who comes in. If we collapse into the presentation of the immediate moment, we collapse ourselves, we move away from our understanding of human nature. More broadly, we have to build the context then, if we're not careful, to understand the figure. That kind of processing is very, very slow. It's linear, and it's also prone to splitting into options. So we don't receive the person sufficiently. We're too busy building an ego-based rational model of what is presenting. When it comes to a complicated situation like that, I suggested to Bob and to his colleague that the scenario itself that they described, that involved 3 people, a fatal shooting, and an injury by one of 2 police officers to themselves. They basically shot themselves with a taser. And then the second officer started to react in a particular way, which led to the death of the third party, who was apparently unarmed. And he had a special needs learning issue, apparently, but he didn't know that. And the analysis of it afterwards had to do with why did the officers act the way they did? What happened to the first officer, a female, who lost control of themselves in the situation, high drive state, pulled out the taser and shot herself instead of the man who apparently was threatening her. The second officer then moved in between the officer on the ground, who was screaming in pain, and that officer, the male officer, did not know what had happened, apparently, because the woman went in ahead and shot herself. He heard her screams. He didn't hear a firearm discharged, so he assumed that she'd been stabbed, therefore the guy was likely to attack him, and he positioned himself between his colleague, who was still on the ground, and the other guy, and put several rounds into his chest and killed him. And then there's all the analysis afterwards, the cognitive-based analysis, to try and work out what went wrong between training and result. So what I suggested is that they need, and they need to, if at all possible, to bring this into training, to train police officers not simply to react according to an abstract level of understanding of situations like that, but to understand that the situation itself was conscious of itself, independently of the people who were present. The actual scenario is uploaded between the 3, and then it's shared. And when you see this happening In a conflict situation, you can stand outside of it and watch it and predict it, because you know as well, unconsciously, where the scenario is going to go, because all of the participants then are held within the field of the scenario which the genome understands. It doesn't matter that the genome didn't understand or doesn't understand tasers and handheld modern firearms, although it is capable of learning very, very quickly, both through epigenetics and through field understanding. The scenario itself at a ground level is sufficient for a genomic ancestral psyche understanding to boot up, and then all three people will move towards a conclusion, even if it's fatal. And that's of huge importance in understanding not only extreme situations like that, but also what happens in any interaction or relationship. Where there's only two people, a therapist and a patient, for example, the field is the same. The ancestral psyche of both is there. And how we react with and to the other person determines what is booted up into a meta-instinctive understanding of the scenario. And with some patients who bring transferences, that is in the ground, that's behind what they initially present with. It's part of their field. They understand us sometimes that way, and they boot up a representation. And if we agree with it, we go along with it, we either become a parent or we reject it, and either of those can be problematical. We have to have an ability to go beyond that which is instantly booted up as a meta instinct and reach in and find an alternative. When we find the alternative by being receptive to it, that can override the otherwise destructive and negative field. And that's what Cesar Millan picks up on with dogs. And we're saying we can do this with people. He picks up the distress of the dog that's uploaded an understanding that it has at an instinctive and genomic level of humans who are threatening it. So it goes on the attack. If the human is not threatening it, then that's different. But you have to be able to react in the right way and understand that the whole field becomes conscious of itself as a determining force once a meta instinct is kicked off. Don't mean archetypes, nothing so superficial as that, but entire scenarios. At that point, and I said it to Bob and his colleague, it's like being in a dream. The dream ego, we are the dream ego, and suddenly we are obliged to act out the dream narrative. And if we are like that in an interpersonal situation, we are being booted up into a representation. Just as the dream understands meta instincts, so does the outer situation. And then the unconscious jumps in and says, this is what's happening here. We're all agreeing that you are going to take 5 rounds from a police service revolver in your chest. We've agreed on that. Whilst I didn't agree that, but you did. You did it unconsciously. That is not to say that you were responsible for what you did by making the wrong judgment consciously. The situation produced that, it layered it. When the female colleague shot herself and went down and was screaming, Paleolithic instincts to protect her came in force for the man. He positioned himself progressively. He was faced with a threat. The Paleolithic instinct would say, you have to protect the woman and protect yourself. Oh yeah, I will. And I've got a revolver. Out it comes. I am a police officer. I have the justification to do this. Cognition starts to attempt to understand a collapse of the situation, and he shoots the guy dead. And then later, when that scenario dissipates and it's gone, other people ask cognitive questions of him, and he can't answer them. Why did you do it? What did you see? What did you not see? This is too much. I can't make a cognitive model of that. He can't, because he was in an instinctive situation, which became meta-instinctive, and then the program was released to deal with it in the context that he found himself. So if we take that model, we can understand fields. And then we understand the field of relationship that we're in at any one moment and how we're all contributing to it. You see domestic arguments, for example, even ones I've attended as a police officer, you see the whole thing is moving towards a conclusion. and people lose their apparent rationality, and they dissolve into the scenario. Now that's best not dealt with by cognition, but you need to use cognition to separate yourself initially out from the influence of the field. But then you need to adopt a meta instinct again and I say, not go looking for it in a cognitive way, open yourself through intuition to receive it. And then you find the whole energy changes because you've become an active agent that's introduced another aspect, another scenario, which is then conscious of itself, and everybody agrees with it and moves us in that direction. If you try and cognitively persuade people in a violent domestic situation, husband, wife, kids, wherever it is, you try and be cognitive, they're not going to listen because you are not a participant in the situation. You're an outsider. And the relative strength of the field as such of the scenario is such that you are expected to move in that particular direction. Now, sometimes, of course, you have to go with it and you have to take control if it's an emergency by applying an instinctive solution. It doesn't have to be shooting someone. But that officer, he had a gun, he had a role. There was a colleague down, may have been stabbed. He didn't know. He couldn't look at it to check because this guy might stab him. He didn't know that he was mentally ill, perhaps to the extent, or had special needs to the extent that he did. But he acted on his conditioned instinct to draw his service revolver and shoot him, or his service weapon and shoot him. And that was justified according to the way that the whole situation was moving. And Bob and his colleague reported their observation before I introduced that the intention was in their intuition, because they couldn't know, they couldn't ask the guy, but they had some information that might be the case, that the guy himself wanted to trigger the scenario that would bring about his own death or the potential for it. So he triggered the situation and then everybody else agreed with it. That can happen a lot with fatal shootings, death by or suicide by cop, as it's called, where you bring the police officer into the agency of your suicide by cop. But that it can happen like, I just want to get assaulted, so I'll go and start an argument. And then the understanding just configures and it goes to conclusion, everybody agrees with it. So scenarios have consciousness of their own. Now, to wind that back then, even into smoking, if there's been some trauma in the past that's led to a person needing to smoke, and I'm not referring to John at all here, but just by way of extension and inclusion, then that is still perseverating from that process. So the meta instinct that for, say, a person who had gone through traumatic experiences and then needed to smoke to reduce their anxiety, it perseverated, doesn't complete. This happens with military people who've got post-traumatic stress disorder as well. The meta instinct couldn't complete itself, it still perseverates. And our way of dealing or helping people with that is to go back before the trauma, to access the non-traumatized psyche, and then to move beyond the trauma, not through it, but beyond it, into a replacement meta-instinctive scenario for the continuation of life in a healthy way, which was anticipated by their genome before they were born, that they should have a good life and it'll be safe, and that you shouldn't go through these traumas, you shouldn't do that, this shouldn't happen to you. Ideally, you should have a healthy life. There's always going to be an agreement deep within the genome for that. So we need to move the person beyond the trauma and into the future. That's when it's that kind of trauma. Where it's something like smoking, though, you may have to address the scenario in passing, not with any depth. You don't need to do that. Where the habit of smoking was then acquired to reduce anxiety or increase status, wherever it was, and gently help a person access a new state, which is already anticipated for and agreed with, which is projected from before the time of the smoking, over the time the person did smoke, into the immediate moment, with an anticipation, and that will continue into the future. Excuse me. So the takeaway from that is that scenarios are conscious because they are very often meta-instinctive, and solutions boot up immediately, and we all start to agree with it. In the same way, as I say, that the dream ego finds itself in a state that it doesn't understand that it is in the sleeping state, but it has the self-concept, but everything is being decided by something else. The dream ego doesn't put the scenario of the dream together. Something is working to make something meet a conclusion. Even after traumas, for example, repeating dreams, it's an attempt to reach a conclusion. And to stop people self-harming, we have to redirect the conclusion so that it doesn't go in that direction. We have to offer a better alternative. Caesar does that with the dog. Rather than be in this high drive state and bite everyone, wouldn't it be better to be happy? And usually, well, it is the outcome. That's what he does. He's so good at what he does. He brings about an adaptive outcome, which means the trauma is forgotten, functionally forgotten for the dog. It's done. It's gone. But we have a different kind of brain, unfortunately. The same up to a point. We've got one that lingers by identification through cognition, usually, and repetition loops, cognitive loops, with traumas from the past, and then we boot up the scenario again. So I hope there's lots there to work on in a focused way with something like smoking, in a wider way to do with field interactions to avoid transferences and to bring about healing, and then a specific way to do with trauma, about how you can do that, and then how they all link with the experience of a dream and the role of the dream ego. Dream ego has to do as it's told by the dream. And unfortunately, when we boot up a meta instinct with other people, when we all agree with it, it's going to go in a certain direction. And sometimes that's a good direction. Sometimes it can be, I'm going to do the right thing here. I'm going to, let's you'll know what it's like. It instantly boots up. There's an emergency situation. Suddenly people do things collaboratively they would never do. They get on with neighbors that they've disliked for decades. They get on with them. They have a common purpose. That's a meta instinct. It's not rational in that ordinary sense. Or you do something heroic that you wouldn't believe that you could do, because the meta instinct is there and it says this is what you do under these conditions. So this approach will help us all to understand just what meta instincts are and just what is conscious. It's not only the ego, it's not only even complexes, it's the entire situation is a superposition field of relative consciousness in simultaneous states that interact and summate to an outcome that it wants to achieve.
And culture plays a part in that too,
It
doesn't
does,
it?
yeah.
The history of any individual culture, because we were saying that had that scenario happened here, certainly during the time of your service as a police officer, there would have been no taser, there would have been no firearm. The young man who was shot and killed may or may not have had a weapon. I don't know whether that was the case in this example or not, but that would have allowed for a very different kind of field to configure in such a way that maybe what transpired did not transpire, or certainly not in the way that it did under these circumstances. And maybe the female officer would have played a more positive role rather than maybe coming out as one of the boys almost, but actually play to her own strengths as a female officer in relationship to the young man.
That's how it was done.
That's how it would have been done in your day.
And I was never shot, but I have faced weapons and I've faced the threat of firearms.
Yes.
Drugs dealers and a guy trying to rob a gas station as well with a pistol. It turned out it was a starting pistol. I didn't know that. I didn't know what the hell it was. Some IRA people as well who weren't armed at the time but didn't know that. Things like that. Plenty of knives, plenty of riots. Had bull terrier set on me. I've had all sorts done, jumped by gangs, and so there's danger. But the bad guys, if they don't anticipate that they could be shot, it's less likely to move the scenario in a direction where that can happen. America's a wonderful country. You know, I love American people. I've got loads of American. We've got some American people here, wonderful people. But the speed at which that country developed is unprecedented. The expansion of it is unprecedented too. I mean, it's only 250 years old now, and you think how quickly they got there, when an entire continent, you know, was brought into I'll call it, and I don't mean this on an individual level or a cultural level, the inflation of that culture and its exploitation of natural resources and all the issues it went through, the Civil War and that. But obviously, the use of firearms, the bearing firearms and using them has been there from the start, and that's a problem they've had to deal with since. And that's an extraordinary pressure. The commonality of that up until recently in Britain, you've never really had to factor in. Colleagues of mine were shot and killed. You know, that did happen. It was rare, though. They're more likely to be beaten to death or stabbed. That happened.
But where weapons don't exist, you are forced back on your own resources.
You're forced back
to
on
relate
your own resources,
better, by and large, aren't you?
Yeah.
You as a human being, as an individual human being, and your character, you know, when that is called upon, that is in a way your ultimate resource.
It is.
How you resolve something, and particularly if you're the only person on the scene, that is being, you know, requested to do that, as has often been the case for you. But certainly then, back in the day, the idea of community policing was all about that.
It was all about that. Everything was relational. Yeah, it didn't always work, but you could do a lot to boot up a scenario in other people that the best way to explain this is that you're not threatening to them, but there is an understanding that you're on different sides of an equation, but you're not personally threatening. You might actually arrest them. You might send them to jail. You know, you might do all of that, but day to day, you're not likely to pull a firearm on them and shoot them. Whether it's a traffic stop, a domestic dispute, or anything like that. If there's going to be violence, there'll be physical violence. There may be weapons involved. But generally, there's the agreement. I always worked on the agreement that people would accept you're in that role. And I'm in this other role, and this is them. My role is to be a criminal, say. But there's an acceptance that you don't go too far. That reduces risk. It reduces risk for them. It reduces risk. It doesn't remove it, but it does reduce it. And then there's a kind of adaptation at a Darwinian level, which means there's a waveform. The crime is reduced, violence is reduced. It doesn't go away, but it's reduced. That wouldn't work in the US, and that's no one's fault over there. That's the way that the environment is uploaded, and it runs and it pulls people towards certain conclusions. So it's just an example. So I'm not criticising
not at all,
Bob or the courage of American police officers.
Not at all. As individual human beings, of course not. No. I mean, the police force that we have now in the UK is not the police force of your day anyway. I mean, it's we're moving in an almost paramilitary direction, quite frankly, where the police occupy that role, the role that the army would have played once. They're a blend of, you know, oh no, I don't really want to say that because they're not a blend of old style policing, but you know what I mean. That has gone, but that they are morphing into more of a paramilitary force than anything else. And you know, when the police turn against the people in that way, and they're in cahoots with the government to say, "Oh, here," I mean, it's not a nice position to be in.
Well, we never had that. We had the principles laid down by somebody called Robert Peel that were held to be the highest standards in other police forces, even in other countries where they couldn't get there. Wasn't their fault.
No.
But those Peelian principles had to do with an unarmed police force that would never be paramilitary, that would work with the community, would represent the people under the law, without fear and without favour.
Yeah, that gives me chills when you say that, because that is there is a profundity to that.
There is, yeah,
that they've moved away from completely.
Yeah, that's the present and recent governments in the UK that's done that. They are turning the British police into a paramilitary force, and they're doing it so they will be the immediate strong arm lever of government against the people.
Yeah.
And they're doing other things in the background, talking about increasing the military budget. You can say, well, that's why. That's another step on from that. So it's all about turning on their own people. So it's a different thing, isn't it?
It is, but you know yourself, if you felt you were going to be treated that way without fear or favour, with that degree of objectivity, I think what it does is that people who have done bad things, there is a tendency then, even in criminals, to say, yeah, I get this scenario, because as you were saying, Steve, you're in that role, I'm in this role, and this is what happens when you do bad things. And they, by and large, certainly your experiences, that people give themselves up.
They did. They used to give themselves up. I even had a murderer give himself up.
You did, yeah.
He just killed a man stone dead with a single punch. And without going into detail anyway, tracked down who he was, related that to another violence assault that occurred around the corner, and got him. And he's a big guy. Got himself to give himself up because it was the right thing to do.
That's rapport, isn't it?
That's rapport.
Even if it's between a policeman and a criminal, it's the understanding again.
There is. That's homeostasis.
It is,
They're the rules that we all agree to. So then the master instincts will configure accordingly. So if we can relate to them, then we get better outcomes. And if we don't, we are dictated by whichever meta instinct is configured. That's really the takeaway.